Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, Driver D. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is busy working a derailment. Recently, I completed a series of videos on how to assemble and configure a basic DCC-EX command station to run our trains. If you haven't already seen those videos, be sure to check them out. In this video, the first in a series, I will introduce you to the basics of JMRI, the Java Model Railroad Interface. I'll provide a broad overview of how JMRI is organized and show you some examples of how we can use JMRI with DCC-EX to program our locomotives and control our trains. In later videos in the series, I will walk you through the process of installing JMRI, creating a roster of locomotives, and setting up custom JMRI throttles to operate our trains. We'll also look at how we can use the Y-Throttle and Engine Driver apps, as well as a variety of physical throttles with JMRI and DCC-EX to control our locomotives. This initial series of videos will focus on JMRI's DecoderPro app and throttles for controlling our trains. I'll come back to the PanelPro app and turnout control later. Be sure to check this video's description for links to the other videos in the series, as well as the various websites and products I mentioned here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We've got freight to move, so let's get this train rolling. An introduction to JMRI. The Java Model Railroad Interface. The Java Model Railroad Interface, universally known as JMRI, is a cross-platform, open-source suite of computer applications for controlling model railroads. JMRI is written in the Java programming language and can run on any computer that can run Java, including Mac, Windows, Linux, and Raspberry Pi. I'll discuss more about how to download and install Java on your Mac or PC in my next video. JMRI connects to a model railroad through a DCC command station, such as DCC-EX. JMRI supports 24 different command stations from a variety of commercial manufacturers, as well as open-source products like DCC-EX. JMRI connects to the command station either via a cable or wirelessly over Wi-Fi. For DCC-EX, the most direct way to connect JMRI is via a USB cable, connecting the Arduino to the computer. However, we can also connect JMRI to DCC-EX over Wi-Fi. It is also possible to set up a computer with JMRI connected to the command station and use it over the internet from anywhere in the world using another computer running JMRI. JMRI is an open-source community effort with contributors from all over the world and is constantly being updated. Driving that train for the last 24 years has been former NMRA DCC Working Group Chair and retired Berkeley particle physics professor Bob Jacobson. Go Bears! While Bob didn't start JMRI, within a few months he was made both its conductor and engineer. The core of JMRI is the DecoderPro App. According to Bob, in the early days, JMRI was just a library project to compile information about DCC decoders available at the time, their features, and how to program them. A small JMRI demo program let users test the library data. At about the same time, another NMRA member, named Mark Gurries, realized that the number of decoders and their features were growing so rapidly that it would be impossible to keep track of them all without a computer program and a team of programmers to help. Mark enlisted his best friend, a software programmer from Apple named Dave, to help him put together a proof of concept for the program, which they called DecoderPro. It used a graphical user interface broken out onto individual tabs or windows to organize various decoder functions, such as motor control and lighting effects. Originally written to run on their Macintosh PowerBooks, Mark and Dave also wanted DecoderPro to work on PCs as well. At the NMRA convention in 2000, Dave found out about JMRI and Bob Jacobson. Mark and Dave realized that if DecoderPro were translated into Java, it could be run on any system that supported Java, including Macs, PCs, and Linux machines. Moreover, switching to Java would allow the decoder description files to be created and edited by any simple text editor. Serendipitously, Mark, Dave, and Bob all lived in the same area. Meeting over lunch at a local burger joint, Mark and Dave pitched their ideas to Bob Jacobson. It was a perfect match. Mark and Dave immediately decided to hand over their DecoderPro project to Bob so that it could be integrated into the JMRI project. Bob rewrote the program in Java, which made it compatible not only with a variety of computer systems, but also with many of the DCC decoders and command stations available at the time. Originally tacked on as a menu item available in the JMRI demo program, soon users were clamoring for the DecoderPro features to be put front and center. Thus, the DecoderPro app was born. Bob Jacobson and the ever-evolving JMRI community always made JMRI freely available for use and copying under an open-source artistic license. Jacobson did his undergraduate work in electrical engineering and computer science at MIT, home of the Tech Model Railroad Club, which I talked about in my most recent video of DCC-EX series bonus materials. As I described in that video, the first chapter of Stephen Levy's best-selling book, Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, featured the TMRC and described its influence on the birth of experimentalist hacker culture, which is not to be confused with the destructive criminal brand of hacking we now hear about in the news all too often. The list of 1960s hacker ethics that Levy describes in Chapter 2 of his book includes the premise that all information should be free. It was from this notion that Stuart Brand coined the term, "Information wants to be free." While many people first assume that this means that information should not cost anything, what it really means is that information should be freely available and free to distribute by anyone to anyone. Maybe it would be better to say that information wants its freedom. This is at the core of the open source movement, which has brought model railroads DCC-EX, DCC++, the Arduino, and JMRI, among others. But it's a movement that almost died in its infancy. Just because information wants its freedom doesn't mean that everyone wants that information to be free. In fact, a large part of our economy is driven by people selling information they have to those who don't have it but want it or need it. Sometimes the sellers have that information because they found it or created it themselves. Sometimes they have it because they took it from someone else. And every now and then, someone will take someone else's information, claim it as their own, and then tell the person that they took the information from that they can no longer have it, unless perhaps they want to pay to get it back. When a criminal hacker does that to our computer with malware attached to our email, it's called ransomware. When a business competitor does that, it's called competition. Either way, that's when we find out, as Bob Jacobson did, that freedom isn't free. In 2004, a JMRI competitor registered the DecoderPro website, even though JMRI had been using the DecoderPro name for 4 years and was in the process of registering the name as a trademark. Then, in 2005, the competitor charged Bob Jacobson and JMRI with patent infringement and sent Bob a $200,000 bill after the competitor patented some of JMRI's technologies. In March 2006, after the competitor started contacting Bob Jacobson's employer, Bob filed suit in federal court to stop these unfair practices. Here's what Bob's lawyer wrote in the amended complaint. Open source software exists side by side with proprietary software whose code is kept secret from the public. As with many informal groups, JMRI project developers neither initially registered copyrights nor trademarked their projects or product names, nor filed patent applications for inventions they created. Nor did they incorporate as businesses. Some projects do later become corporations and run businesses, and thus have legal protections available to them. But what of the fledgling open source projects like the JMRI project and their individual software developers that create valuable intellectual property, which is later stolen and used by others for their own profit, or worse, patented and used against the very members of the open source project who created it? Unmoved by these claims, in August 2007, the federal district judge ruled that because Bob never had an expectation of compensation by making JMRI available for free on the internet, Bob could not sue for unfair competition. And because open source software benefits all potential licensees, Bob could not sue for unjust enrichment. However, most fundamentally, the judge ruled that because JMRI's open source license explicitly gives users the right to use and distribute the material and is intentionally broad, the alleged violation of the open source license was unlikely to be a copyright violation. In other words, you could not copyright open source material. This was a direct attack on the very existence of the open source movement. The following month, in September 2007, Bob and JMRI appealed the court's ruling to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. Several other open source groups, including Creative Commons, the Linux Foundation, the Open Source Initiative, the Software Freedom Law Center, the Perl Foundation, and the Wikimedia Foundation, filed friend of the court briefings supporting JMRI and urging the appeals court to overturn the ruling. And in August 2008, the Federal Appeals Court did just that. Here is some of what that court said. We consider here the ability of a copyright holder to dedicate certain work to free public use and yet enforce an open source copyright license to control the future distribution and modification of that work. Through this controlled spread of information, the copyright holder gains creative collaborators to the open source project and gains others' knowledge that can be used to advance future software releases. The case went back to the district court. Undaunted by the ruling of the appeals court, the JMRI competitor countersued Bob Jacobson for an excess of $6 million for copyright infringement for materials the competitor had originally obtained from JMRI. Finally, in December 2009, the district court ruled. The judge found that JMRI was copyrightable, that the JMRI competitor had infringed on that copyright, and that Bob Jacobson could sue for damages. The judge also found that the competitor had acted in bad faith when it registered the DecoderPro website and dismissed the competitor's $6 million countersuit. In February 2010, 4 years after it began and 6 years after the first legal issues arose, the case was settled. The settlement included a permanent injunction barring the competitor from misusing JMRI software and copyrights. The competitor also agreed to mediation and arbitration in any future disputes with JMRI. Finally, the competitor paid Bob Jacobson $100,000 towards legal expenses. Bob was generous and gracious in this, as the $100,000 did not even cover his legal costs, not to mention 6 years of his time. As Bob said, sometimes the best you can do is the best you can do. But the open source movement, especially for open source software, owes a huge debt to Bob Jacobson and his fight to keep JMRI free. As the Wikipedia page on open source software states, the ruling of Bob's case cemented enforcement under copyright law when the conditions of the license were not followed. Because of the similarity of the JMRI artistic license to other open source software licenses, the ruling created a precedent that applied widely. Perhaps the appeals court said it best. Under an open source license, the copyright holder gains creative collaborators to the open source project and gains others' knowledge that can be used to advance future software releases. Over time, the number of contributors to JMRI has grown. Now, after 25 years, hundreds of different people have contributed to JMRI, and dozens of versions and hundreds of updates have been released. Sadly, the burger joint where Mark, Dave, and Bob first met to discuss DecoderPro closed in 2020 during the early days of the pandemic after 75 years in business. More tragically, Mark Gurries, who first had the idea for what became DecoderPro, passed away in November 2023 after health complications at the young age of 62. Model Railroader magazine posted a touching in memoriam to Mark on its website, remembering Mark's contributions to the hobby and DCC. Why JMRI? As I described in my first video, I designed the D-Saver, my small, portable, HO scale, 1 foot by 6 foot switching puzzle layout, so that I could run my sound-equipped DCC locomotives and conduct switching operations in the small space I had available. Even though I had an old DCC command station stored away somewhere in a closet, I knew that for the D-Saver I wanted to do something else. One of the biggest frustrations I had when I started running DCC locomotives nearly 20 years ago was programming the locomotive decoders and then remembering how they were programmed. NMRA DCC standards specify that decoders are programmed and configured using what are called configuration variables, or CVs. In any given decoder, there could be dozens or even hundreds of different CVs, and each brand or model of decoder will likely have a different set of CVs. Further, the values in those CVs are likely to be different in each locomotive depending on what features it has, how fast or slow it runs, whether it runs alone or in a consist, whether it is a diesel, electric, or steam locomotive, and whether it runs on both DC and DCC layouts. Setting and keeping track of all those CVs using a traditional DCC command station requires entering and reading the CV values 1 digit at a time on a numeric keypad. Also, while DCC systems may remember our locomotive's road numbers, they don't store the locomotive's CV settings so they can be quickly copied to other locomotives or reinstalled after resetting a locomotive to its factory settings, which means we have to keep track of them all ourselves in spreadsheets and tables. Rick from SoCal Scale Models, whose channel I featured in my first video last year, recently wanted to reprogram the sound volume for the prime mover on one of his locomotives, and his experience perfectly illustrates some of these challenges.
He is loud. I should just quiet him down right now. I'm going to stop right in the street. I'm going to throw him on the programming track and quiet him down just a little bit. All right, well, that was fun. It took like, I don't know, half an hour to figure that out again. So I had to figure out how to program the alternate prime mover sound volume. Go figure. Now these are Soundtrack's Tsunami 2 decoders. I just had to refresh my memory there. So in order to do the alternate volume, you have to go into CV32, switch that from a 1 to a 2. That's your alternate. And then the prime mover was 293, I think it was? 291. So after changing 32 to 2, then he changed 291 to the volume of the prime. That's the volume of the prime mover, and it was on 40. I set it to 30, so hopefully he's a little better right here. Horn is still nice and loud, but he's a little... It's not quite as loud as he was before over here. A little bit better on camera here. I don't know. We'll see. So every locomotive, I decided I adjust the same thing, so, you know, I kind of keep track of what their sound volume are set at and what their, you know, like momentum and, you know, all that stuff. So anyway, I was trying to find my spreadsheet, and then I was trying to read my spreadsheet, and then I was trying to program it, and then I couldn't remember. So it took like half an hour to do all that mumbo jumbo. Ooh, it looks nice here with that background now, huh? At least we got something to look at over here.
The second big frustration I had with my traditional DCC system was trying to remember which functions did what on each locomotive and how to use each locomotive's features. While some newer DCC controllers let us store information about each locomotive's functions, standard DCC controllers are not much help, as most only contain unmarked numeric keypads. Although some functions are standard on most locomotives, such as F0 for the headlight, other functions do vastly different things on different locomotives. Does F2 sound the horn, or turn on the ditch lights? Does F7 dim the headlight, or activate the brakes? Also, which function button on this locomotive starts up the prime mover sounds? And which one turns on the gyro light? Keeping track of all the decoder CV settings and locomotive functions by hand can be quite a chore, especially on locomotives that have a lot of features and sounds. Finding the right function buttons in the middle of an operating session to do what we want with the locomotives we are running can feel like playing a game of darts while blindfolded. Fortunately, JMRI is here to help with both of these problems. As Mark Gurries originally envisioned 25 years ago, the DecoderPro app makes programming and keeping track of locomotive decoder settings a breeze, and JMRI throttles make it easy to see what functions each locomotive has and which function buttons activate which feature. But even more than that, JMRI communicates with DCC-EX as well as the Y-Throttle and Engine Driver apps so that they can also benefit from and use the information stored in JMRI. As I mentioned earlier, JMRI consists of a suite of apps that work together, and it includes more than just the DecoderPro app and Throttles. It also includes a PanelPro app to control our layouts, along with a DispatcherPro tool for train automations and an OperationsPro tool for generating train manifests and switch lists. There is even a SoundPro app to allow us to control computer playback of sounds on our layout. This introductory series of videos will focus on the DecoderPro app and JMRI Throttles. These two pieces of JMRI are focused primarily on our locomotives. We'll look at the JMRI DecoderPro app first, then we'll look at JMRI Throttles. We'll come back to the PanelPro app, which is focused on our layouts and some of the other train-centric tools in later videos. We've cleared the main and are ready to set out our deliveries, so check the waybills again and we'll make our cuts. The DecoderPro app. The DecoderPro app is the heart of JMRI and is designed to help us manage our DCC locomotives. Here is a description from the November 2004 issue of Model Railroader magazine. One of the most useful things about Digital Command Control, DCC, is that it allows us to customize decoder functions. A decoder's address, lighting effects, motor control, and function mapping are all controlled by adjustable numeric values called configuration variables, CVs. However, programming CV values on the small display screens of most DCC systems can be time-consuming and is often frustrating. Thankfully, a group of dedicated hobbyists have created computer software that makes the task of programming decoders much simpler. Meet DecoderPro. DecoderPro is a computer program that features easy-to-use display screens, allowing you to choose how you want your decoder to work by simply clicking your mouse. The software then enters the correct numeric values in the decoder's CVs for you. Sound good? It is, and it's free. 20 years later, DecoderPro is still good, still allows us to choose how we want our locomotive decoders to work by simply clicking a mouse, and is still free. But DecoderPro also functions as a locomotive roster manager. In fact, the roster screen is the first one we see when we launch the DecoderPro app, and where we can identify and add our DCC locomotives. Once we program all our locomotives, we will probably spend most of our time with DecoderPro in the roster window. In this window, we will see information about all our locomotives, including their DCC address, decoder type, and a name, road number, ID, and model number that we assign. We can also include a graphic icon and a photo for each locomotive. In addition, we can also create roster groups, which contain subsets of our locomotive fleets. We can call these anything we like and include whichever locomotives we want in them. I have one roster group for my 6-axle road units and another for my Athearn Genesis sound-equipped Jeeps. Once we select a locomotive from the roster, we can have DecoderPro earn its name by choosing to program it. We can choose to program our locomotives on the programming track or on the main track. Once we choose to program or edit a locomotive's settings, the DecoderPro programming or editing window will open. This window will contain multiple tabs that take us to different screens that allow us to access different features of our locomotives. For example, one screen will allow us to program the DCC address and some other basic information about our locomotives. Other screens will allow us to program the CVs that determine how our locomotive runs and its speed settings. Still other screens allow us to program the CVs that control the lights or sounds. Moreover, the specific set of screens included in the window, as well as their contents, are specific to the particular decoder in our locomotive. So a basic 4-function decoder, for example, will have fewer tabs and screens with fewer functions to program than an 8-function decoder with sound. And a decoder from one manufacturer will have different screens and functions than a decoder from another. But in each and every case, we can program our locomotives based on a description of their specific functions without having to know or remember anything about the specific CVs. Of course, DecoderPro does allow you to program CVs directly as well if you wish. Once we program or read the CVs of a locomotive in DecoderPro, we can save that information, and DecoderPro will remember and store it in our JMRI library. This will allow us to restore our saved CV settings on our locomotives if we ever need to change them for some reason or reset them to their factory settings. We can also edit, copy, duplicate, archive, or make various versions of the settings to use in different scenarios without actually making any changes to the locomotives until we are ready. We'll delve into more of the details of using the DecoderPro app in my next video and look at how to add and program a new locomotive, copy settings from one locomotive to another, and make backup copies of our locomotive settings in case we ever need to restore them to a prior configuration. As I mentioned previously, the DecoderPro app is the part of JMRI that is focused most on our locomotives as opposed to our layouts and operations. We've already seen how DecoderPro includes a roster of our locomotives. One of the other features of the DecoderPro app, which has absolutely nothing to do with decoders, is the ability to configure the specific function buttons that will be available on the JMRI throttle for each locomotive, as well as the photo and icon that will be displayed with that locomotive. We'll take a quick look at JMRI throttles next. JMRI throttles. In addition to programming decoders, the JMRI DecoderPro app also provides direct access to a dedicated throttle for each locomotive on our roster. Near the bottom of the DecoderPro main window, below the programming button, are two additional buttons, one for labels and media and the other for throttles. As I mentioned before, the DecoderPro app provides us with the ability to configure the throttle function buttons for each of our locomotives, as well as include a photo and icon of our locomotive. To do this, we first select a locomotive from our roster. Then we click the Labels and Media button at the bottom of the DecoderPro window. This opens up a simplified programming window containing just two tabs or screens. The first tab allows us to configure the throttle buttons for the specific functions for each of our locomotives. We can decide what text we want to appear in each throttle button, assign icons to use as buttons, and choose whether the button should behave like an on-off switch or just a momentary push button. The second tab takes us to the Roster Media screen, which allows us to add an image and an icon that will be used in the JMRI throttle for the selected locomotive. The icon is also the one that will appear in the DecoderPro roster window. Once we configure our throttle buttons and add our media, we can save the changes to our roster and close the window. Now, whenever we want to run our trains, we simply select the locomotive we want to run from the roster and press the throttle button to open its throttle. The throttle will open with all the function buttons we programmed, as well as the graphics we added. We can also edit and arrange the size and contents of the throttle window, as well as set some properties for how the speed slider works. For example, on my small D-Saver switching layout, I use a continuous throttle, where 0 is in the middle of the slider, so that I do not have to think about which direction the locomotive is set to go. If I move the slider up, the locomotive will go forwards, and if I move the slider down, it will go backwards. The direction indicators on the throttle change automatically. Also, within the throttle window, there is an address panel we can use to select another locomotive or run a consist. If we want to switch to a different locomotive, we can release the current locomotive and select another, either by typing its DCC address in the box, or, if it is a locomotive in our roster, by selecting it from the drop-down menu in the panel. The throttle window will reconfigure with the function buttons and graphics for the selected locomotive. But we aren't limited to just one throttle. We can open up as many as we like, and even save and open groups of throttles. Further, when we configure a JMRI throttle for a locomotive in our roster, we can export that information to DCC-EX, and also import it into the Y-Throttle or Engine Driver apps on our phone or tablet, and they will remember those settings in the future, even if we're not using JMRI. Once we configure a throttle for our locomotive, there are a number of ways that we can use it to run our trains. Of course, we can click on the buttons and drag the slider with our mouse. And if our mouse has a scroll wheel, we can use the wheel to move the speed slider as long as the mouse pointer is in that part of the throttle window. However, we can also use a variety of keyboard shortcuts to operate the throttle. By default, the throttle is configured to be fully controllable using just a numeric keypad. The plus key will move the throttle slider up, while the minus key will move the slider down. The arrow keys also do the same. The number keys on the keypad will operate the throttle function keys from 0 to 9, and along with the shift or control keys, all the functions up to F28. We can customize these keys and add more if we like. This provides us with a tremendous amount of flexibility because we don't necessarily need to use our regular computer keyboard to control the throttle. Almost anything that can communicate with the computer will work. We can use an inexpensive wireless number pad, for example, or get creative with a variety of different types of controllers that we can configure to work with JMRI through our computer. And we can connect to JMRI with the Y-Throttle and Engine Driver apps over Wi-Fi and use them instead of or in addition to JMRI throttles, and they will work together in tandem. We can even open a throttle in a web page and control our trains over the internet. Finally, JMRI offers some tools specifically for DCC-EX that we can use with JMRI throttles when running our locomotives, including a window we can use to send commands to DCC-EX, a current meter, and even a virtual LCD that will display messages from DCC-EX, just like the LCD we installed in a prior video. We'll look more closely at some of the throttle settings and how we can use them in another video. But we've completed our deliveries for today, so it's time to head back to the yard and enjoy a short rest. I'm sure there will be another train waiting for us when we get there. Let's run some trains. There's lots more to cover with JMRI, and we've barely scratched the surface. In addition to the locomotive-centric DecoderPro app and Throttles, JMRI also has a layout-focused app called PanelPro, which lets us control all the turnouts, signals, and sensors on our layout. The PanelPro app incorporates a number of tools designed for operations, generating switch lists, and automated running. There's even a SoundPro app to control all the sounds on the layout. For now, however, we will start with the DecoderPro app and JMRI throttles, as everything else builds from there. We will look at PanelPro and possibly some of the other tools in later videos. JMRI and DCC-EX also work well together. DCC-EX likewise has numerous automation and layout control features, and we can use JMRI to control those features. While we certainly don't need JMRI to use DCC-EX, doing so will make programming our locomotives and configuring our throttles much easier, and allow us to do some things we couldn't do with DCC-EX alone. But enough talking. Let's go run some trains. What's next? Installing and configuring JMRI. In my next video, I will show you how to install and configure JMRI along with the Java runtime environment it needs to function. We'll also take a first look at how to use DecoderPro to program our locomotives and customize JMRI throttles. After that, we'll look at some of the JMRI features specifically designed for DCC-EX and how to use them. We'll also look at how to use the Y-Throttle and Engine Driver apps with JMRI and DCC-EX to run our trains. And we'll look at some of the different kinds of hardware throttles we can use with JMRI and DCC-EX together. I told you there was a lot to cover. We've got 100 freight cars or more on this train, and we've only inspected the first one. So check all the brakes and the air hoses, watch for sagging couplers, and make sure there are no flat spots on the wheels. And I'll meet you at the next one. Until then, Thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, were you able to clear the derailment? Great, because we've got a lot of freight to move. All aboard!